Hi, this is Paul. This is an experiment. It's an experiment with the YouTube. Let's see if maybe if I, Benjamin Boyce said if I pump up the narrative speed, might have less trouble. So I want to integrate some of the material from Carl Truman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, because he's got a lot of pieces in here that actually pertain to a lot of what we've been working on. Adjust my windows so they're a little bit better. There we go. So let's give this a try.
Sherlock Holmes, A Scandal in Bohemia. I noted in the introduction that the underlying argument of this book.
It's a little too fast. Let's slow it down a little bit. It's in Audible books, it varies a lot from reader to reader. Some readers are real slow and you can kind of crank them up. Some readers are a little faster and you can't crank them up quite so much.
Is that the sexual revolution and its various manifestations in modern society cannot be treated in isolation, but must rather be interpreted as the specific and perhaps the most obvious social manifestation of a much deeper and wider revolution in the understanding of what it means to be a self. While sex may be presented today as little more than a recreational activity, sexuality is presented as that which lies at the very heart of what it means to be an authentic person.
Now, that point he makes right there, and he's going to get into it a little bit later in the book when he starts talking about identity. Sex is both diminished as an activity, but elevated as an identity at the same time. And the reality of that exchange is not incidental to what is going on.
That is a profound claim that is arguably unprecedented in history. How that situation comes to be is a long and complicated story.
Now that is very much in contrast, let's say, with what's happening in late antiquity, or even in the first century, or throughout the whole classical period. One of the points that's made often is that you had male and female, that was understood, but you didn't have a sexual identity the way we have now. And there were certainly norms regarding sex. And for example, for the Roman male body, you could penetrate, but not be penetrated. And because the one who penetrated and the one who was penetrated was a function of status. Okay. But now we have all of these identities, and Truman is going to get into this, and I'm trying to figure out the best way to sort of approach this book on the channel. And this little experiment will give me an idea of how much reading I have to do. I'd rather let the audiobook read and then do commentary on it like I do with videos, rather than just have to read and do commentary. This is a little bit easier for me.
And I can address only a few of the most salient aspects of the relevant narrative in a single volume. And even before I attempt to do so, it is first necessary to set forth a number of basic theoretical concepts that provide a framework, a set of what we might describe as architectural principles, for structuring and analysing the personalities, events, and ideas that play into the rise of the modern self. In this task, the writings of three analysts of modernity are particularly useful: Charles Taylor, the philosopher; Philip Rieff, the psychological sociologist; and Alistair MacIntyre, the ethicist. While all three have different emphases and concerns, they offer accounts of the modern world that share certain important affinities, and also provide helpful insights into understanding not simply how modern Western society thinks, but how and why it has come to think the way that it does. In this chapter and the next, therefore, I want to offer an outline of some of their key ideas that help set the scene for the interpretation of our contemporary world offered in the subsequent account of how the concept of the modern psychologized and sexualized self has emerged. The social imaginary. To return to the questions I posed in the introduction, how has the current highly individualistic, iconoclastic, sexually obsessed, and materialistic mindset come to triumph in the West? Or to put the question in a more pressing and specific fashion as I did earlier, why does the sentence, "I am a woman trapped in a man's body," make sense not simply to those who have sat in post-structuralist and queer theory seminars, but to my neighbours, to people I pass on the street, to co-workers who have no particular political axe to grind and who are blissfully unaware of the rebarbative jargon and arcane concepts of Michel Foucault.
Now this is actually a really important question, because it's clear that I'm going to get at this. In our culture, we very much have a participatory sense of us. And in democracy, we value our ability to participate. We participate by voting. We participate by activism of various sorts. And now with social media, our sense of participation has just enlarged. And so the questions here are, well, how does change happen? Now, in the past, I've talked about bounded set and center set dynamics, and these are often used by people in videos to make points about, usually it's sort of a change thing where they'll say, well, in the past, we've conceptualized our culture as a bounded set culture, and that what that means is that we had these fixed ideas of right and wrong. And let's say these posts, let's call them the fence posts, might have been, let's say, Bible verses. We've got it. Let's say if we're talking about same-sex marriage or something, or same-sex sexuality, you've got Leviticus, you've got Romans, you've got Genesis, you've got Deuteronomy. And so basically these are all the fence posts, and that's how you know that right is in the inside and wrong is outside of the inside. And that's a bounded set. But then in missiology, this is Paul Hibert who came up with this idea. In missiology, this gets very difficult, because part of the difficulty that maybe if you had in Victorian England is that you had certain cultural aspects here that didn't really fit. An example was given once of clothing. Okay, so the missionaries would go to a village and they were shocked that everyone was running around nearly naked. And so the missionaries were in a great fuss. You know, people who like the Poisonwood Bible, you know, really love illustrations like this. People were in a great fuss to make sure that all of the natives were wearing clothing. The one piece of information that they didn't understand was that in that particular culture, they understood clothing, they had clothing, but only basically the cultural equivalent of prostitutes wore clothing. So by clothing all the women, they basically culturally turned the whole village into prostitutes, or at least the women of the village into prostitutes. So, I mean, stories like this. And so therefore, instead of a bounded set, what we need is a centered set. And either you can have the idea of right being in the middle, or maybe you can have, let's say, Jesus being in the middle. You can find illustrations of this on the internet. And then the question is, are they getting closer to or further away from Jesus? Now this is not a bad idea, because what it does is it illustrates some of the complex dynamics of morality. Morality is always both binary and also analog. And the reality of this in terms of social change is that bounded set and centered set actually live in the same system. And that what happens is that these boundary posts do, in fact, move, and the entire situation sort of morphs as it goes through time. And you might say that in Christianity, for example, one of the complex ideas that you have about biblical interpretation is the analogy of Scripture. Well, what does that mean? Well, that idea sort of has the concept that there's a general sense overall of, let's say, what the Bible teaches. And then if you have a particular Bible verse, that has to somehow be in relationship with the rest of the teachings of Scripture. And so you you interpret some verses in the light of other verses, and then sometimes in the conversation, those things will sort of switch positions. And you see this classically with ideas around Calvinist Arminian discussions. Do we choose God or does God choose us? And so one group will tend to read the other's verses in the light of their own position. This is the rule, these are the exceptions, and this is the rule, and these are the exceptions. So you tend to go back and forth. So when we get into ideas about social change, this gets really complex because someone sent me one of the latest Carefree Wanderers videos where he's talking about Ukraine and Putin, and he wants much more of a, let's say, a conciliar posture towards Putin in order to prevent the catastrophe of thermonuclear war, and he talks about that. And of course, people are, what you shouldn't do is it's the pariah principle. You're turning Putin into a pariah, and once you turn Putin into a pariah, then you turn it into sort of a zero-sum game, and there's no coming back from that, and that's a real problem. So everything's just sort of right and wrong. Well, the difficulty is that there's always those two senses in what you're doing. There's always sort of the binary zero-sumness of the issue, and then there's the analog of the issue. And, even though no one might be making a bigger claim at pointing out that Putin and the Russians are a pariah than, let's say, the Ukrainians, but yet the Ukrainians are at the same time negotiating with them. And so you say, well, if you turn them into a pariah, there's no negotiation. Well, yeah, but then you wind up actually negotiating with them because you're actually living in this real world, and to one degree or another, the pariah, the demonizing of your enemy is in some ways a negotiating strategy. So does that mean there isn't black and white, on and off, good and bad? No. It just means that both of these systems are living in a world together. Now, what Truman wants to talk about here is, I think, in some ways, it's sort of good to liken it to an iceberg, where there we go. Liken it something to an iceberg, where let's imagine that the part of the iceberg, the 10% that's up top, is sort of reason and consciousness. This is the choosing parts of my consciousness Congress. But below, we've got all of this other stuff going on. You've got influences in the water. And so why is it that attitudes and behaviors and positions will all change unbeknownst to us and unseen by us? Now, again, in the particular battle within the Christian Reformed Church over same-sex marriage, a lot of this is going on. People are having all sorts of different ideas about what is good, bad, right, or wrong. Now, the idea is generally projected onto a sort of a progressivist assumption that, well, given enough time, everybody in the Christian Reformed Church will be in favor of same-sex marriage, and all of these old farts with their old ideas will go away. And in fact, what will happen is that people will start reading the Bible differently, and no, that may happen. And that's why I say it could take generations for something like this to change. But when you talk about consciousness, you tend to talk about a fairly binary, you've got right and you've got wrong. And those things tend to be upper and lower register, right and wrong. It's always right, it's always wrong. Therefore, we're going to take this position, project it back over time, and say that anybody before 2013, let's say, who didn't evolve their view on the morality of sexuality was wrong. In other words, there's something that's very binary about right and wrong. It's almost inescapably binary, almost inescapably upper register, almost inescapably eternal. And so part of what Truman wants to tackle here is the social imaginary, which is for Charles Taylor the mechanism by which this change happens in the iceberg way down below without people consciously having any idea of what's going on.
And his myriad epigonies and incomprehensible imitators. The statement is, after all, emblematic of a view of personhood that has almost completely dispensed with the idea of any authority beyond that of personal psychological conviction, an oddly Cartesian notion. I think I am a woman, therefore I am a woman. How did such a strange idea become the common orthodox currency of our culture?
And it is a strange idea. If you were to say this to an ancient Greco-Roman, they would have really looked at you funny. What, is there a woman inside of you? Even when you say it that, well, what do you mean inside of me? They would have defaulted probably into language of spirits, and that's. I see that Peugeot and Vervaeke just have a new video out, so I'm definitely going to watch that and going to have to digest that, because I think part of what we're going to deal with, and part of what I want to deal with in this book too, is our current language is inadequate, and I think some older forms of language might be repurposed in order to get a better sense, to speak more accurately about what's going on, and hopefully in some ways be more conversant with longer term ways of talking about these things.
To make some attempt at addressing the issue, it is useful to take note of a helpful concept deployed by Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor in his analysis of how societies think, that of the social imaginary. Taylor is interesting because he is a philosopher whose work also engages with broader historical and sociological themes. In A Secular Age, he offers a major analysis of the way modern society in general, and not just the intellectual classes, has moved away from being permeated by Christianity and religious faith, to the point that such are no longer the default for the majority of people, but actually are rather exceptional. In the course of his argument, he introduces the idea of the social imaginary to address the question of how theories developed by social elites might be related to the way ordinary people think and act.
Now, part of what there's so much assumed in this sort of operation, one of which is that we can track people by virtue of their ideas. It's sort of the best we have, but there's so much abstraction and all. We can track people. Which people? What people? By their ideas. What on earth are ideas?
Even when such people have never read these elites or spent any time self-consciously reflecting on the implications of their theories. Here is how he defines the concept. I want to speak of social imaginary here rather than social theory, because there are important differences between the two. There are, in fact, several differences. I speak of imaginary, one, because I'm talking about the way ordinary people imagine their social surroundings. And this is often not expressed in theoretical terms. It is carried in images, stories, legends, etc. But it is also the case that, two, theory is often the possession of a small minority, whereas what is interesting in the social imaginary is that it is shared by large groups of people, if not the whole society. Which leads to a third difference. Three, the social imaginary is that common understanding which makes possible common practices and a widely shared sense of legitimacy. As Taylor describes it here, the social imaginary is a somewhat amorphous concept, precisely because it refers to the myriad beliefs, practices, normative expectations, and even implicit assumptions that members of a society share and that shape their daily lives.
And so imaginary sort of turns it into an arena, which I think is important. So what changes is this arena within which the agent works. But now there's, again, partly in our participatory context, we imagine we participatory in the arenic aspect of our culture as agents within. And so we believe that we can sort of, in a centered set way, move the entire arena. And that's basically what social activism is intended to do.
It is not so much a conscious philosophy of life as a set of intuitions and practices. In sum, the social imaginary is the way people think about the world, how they imagine it to be, how they act intuitively in relation to it. Though that is emphatically not to make the social imaginary simply into a set of identifiable ideas. It is the totality of the way we look at our world, to make sense of it, and to make sense of our behavior within it.
Now, it may be that the language of ideas is going to go away because we're discovering that they're just too small, they're just too thin. It's also helpful to remember that sort of in Vervaeke's 4P knowledge, our orientation, our participation, our perspectival knowledge is very significant here within the arena. And it's not so much ideas, the context feels far more living.
This is a very helpful concept, precisely because it takes account of the fact that the way we think about many things is not grounded in a self-conscious belief in a particular theory of the world to which we have committed ourselves.
This gets into, and this is, again, some people don't like when I keep saying that modernity is leaving. It's another great example of it, because we have our idea of how a person operates is no longer sort of what I sketched out in my Sunday school class, that we are just sort of animals with reason attached. No, that's not how who we understand we are. We understand that there's all of these intuitions and that we start believing something long before our conscious realization of its belief lands. And we see this with all sorts of ideas. And it's partly in this context of hyper change that we recognize this about ourselves.
We live our lives in a more intuitive fashion than that. The fact that I am a woman trapped in a man's body makes sense to Joe Smith. Probably has far less to do with him being committed to an elaborate understanding of the nature of gender and its relationship to biological sex, than to the fact that it seems intuitively correct to affirm someone in his or her chosen identity, and hurtful not to do so, however strange the particulars of that self-identification might have seemed to previous generations. We might perhaps say that, looked at from this angle, the social imaginary is a matter of intuitive social taste. And the question of how the tastes and intuitions of the general public are formed is the question of how the social imaginary comes to take the shape that it does.
Now, this is partly what I'm talking about in church. And so confessionally, a Protestant confessionalism sort of assumes a modern approach to persons and knowing. We write down all of our beliefs, and we think that, well, once we have those beliefs written down, these are what we're going to live through and live by. Now, of course, anybody who actually works in the context of a church knows that isn't true. And so part of the process is to try to hold people accountable to those beliefs. This is what you said you'd live by, now live by it. And that game isn't obviously completely abandoned by those who are postmodern. But what this recognizes is that a whole bunch of people just woke up in church and had different ideas about human sexuality, and at some point decided, well, the church should change to fit their new ideas about human sexuality, that the sentence, I am a man in a woman's body, or I'm a woman in a man's body, makes sense to them. Well, what do we know? What do we mean by making sense? And it's very much a communal process by which this happens. And again, the people, even people who are articulating this or feeling this about themselves, they may know very little or nothing of the theory, but they're having an experience in a communal sense, and then the language comes down, they say, aha, that's exactly my experience. And it isn't just a matter of a post hoc labeling of something, I don't think. I think these things are deeply in the water underneath, impacting them and forming them so that eventually the language just sort of arrives.
Sometimes, as Taylor notes, the theories of the elite do infiltrate these imaginaries. For example, the ideas of Luther on church authority came to grip the popular imagination in 16th century Saxony and beyond through myriad popular pamphlets and woodcuts designed to have an impact on everyday people. And one might add that sometimes the theories of the elite have an affinity with elements of the existing social imaginary that reinforces them, that provides them with an idiom by which they might be expressed or justified, or that transforms them. Sexual identity politics might be a good example, whereby sex outside the ideal of monogamous heterosexual marriage has always occurred, but has only recently become much easier to transact with the advent of cheap and efficient contraception.
And in other words, there are multiple layers to this. And I think as I read Truman's book, I'm going to want to sort of add on to it some of the kinds of thoughts and ideas that I've been having all along.
It has also moved from being primarily personal in significance to also being political, given the debates that swirl around abortion, birth control, and LGBTQ+ matters. The way this occurred is fairly simple to discern. First, there was the promiscuous behavior. Then there was the technology to facilitate it in the form of contraception and antibiotics. And as technology enabled the sexually promiscuous to avoid the natural consequences of their actions, unwanted pregnancies, disease, so those rationales that justified the behavior became more plausible, and arguments against it became less so.
Now, it's almost impossible to not participate in this, but it might be a little subtle, but in reading the sentence, you might have noticed that he sort of turned the sexually promiscuous into an identity group. And again, this is a different approach from, let's say, a classical approach that might say that a spirit of sexual promiscuity occupied, inhabited, and expressed its agency through the individual. The devil made me do it. Cupid made me do it. I'm just a girl who can't say no. So this tendency to identify and then to take that as the starting point by which, let's say, we have mechanistic or technological enabling, well, this runs really deep, and I think in some ways inescapably in us. That we continue to have these forces that, in some sense, once they take hold, we can't get away from them.
And therefore the behavior itself became more acceptable. Any account of the sexual revolution and of the underlying revolution in the understanding of the self, of which the sexual revolution is simply the latest iteration, must therefore not simply take into account the ideas of the cultural elite, but must also look at how the intuitions of society at large have been formed. Ideas in themselves are only part of the story. The notion of the self that makes transgenderism plausible certainly has its theoretical and philosophical rationales, but it is also the product of much wider cultural phenomena that have shaped the intuitions of those who are blissfully unaware of its various intellectual origins and metaphysical assumptions.
Now, the questions are going to be, does this language work? Because again, we've talked about ideas, but we notice that ideas aren't just ideas. Ideas are living in a shared world with technology and abilities and other telotic factors such as harm. The rational person looks ahead and says, wow, sexual activity is going to get me punished. Now, there's a whole range of things right in that little drama. Remove the punishing, and maybe sexual activity will be pursued. What's causing the desire for sexual activity? So there's a whole lot going on here. Now I'm going to stop this here because I need to upload this to YouTube and to see what YouTube does with this. We'll see. I might add on to it, and I might not. I'm at the mercy of the algorithm and the intellectual property checkers. So, I want to continue with this.